Thank you so much, Stanya, and thank you for everyone for joining us for this conversation with Stanya Kahn about her new film, No Go Backs. I'm Amy Beste. I'm Director of Public Programs at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, where I organize the Conversations at the Edge series. And that's a collaboration between the School of the Art Institute of Chicago's Department of Film, Video, New Media, and Animation, the Gene Siskel Film Center, and the Video Data Bank. And we're super excited, super proud to be able to co-present tonight's program. And I just wanted to remind everyone watching that if you have questions for Stanya or if you have comments about the film, please leave them in the comments and our behind the scenes moderator will make sure that we see them and forward them to us. So Stanya, I've had the pleasure of following and showing your work over the years, and I'm super excited about this new piece. As has been noted by other critics and other curators, this is a piece that really builds on and also departs from some of your previous works, and it really stakes some new aesthetic terms and also builds on some kind of long-standing themes, but in new ways. And just to give some folks, just to kind of frame our conversation and give some folks a little bit of background about your career in case they don't know it right off the top of their heads, but you began your career in San Francisco as part of an interdisciplinary queer performance dance scene. And over the years, you built this really rich, protean body of work that spans drawing, painting, animation, performance, video. Videos where you put fictional characters in real spaces in and around Los Angeles, which is where you make your home now. And your work also really touches on these really profound and fundamental themes like the social contract, social relations, marginality, alienation, and care, which I think is a big part of why this piece is in this show. And also, touches upon those things, particular to this moment of economic precarity, ongoing inequality, and also massive climate change. And so I really wanted to start this conversation because I think that this piece, No Go Backs, is no different. I think it's also taking on these huge themes, but I wanted to start it by kind of thinking about the sites, or maybe talking about the sites where this film takes place, because I think that's one way to kind of get into these larger themes. So the film No Go Backs, it follows these two central characters as they make their way from the city into the Eastern Sierra, and the landscape is so present. It's so important. It's not just a backdrop. It's not just a setting. It's another kind of central character. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about, why these particular sites or the genesis for wanting to shoot in these particular locations.
Sure. Thank you so much. And just briefly, I just wanted to thank you guys for having me and thank Janine and you for inviting me, and so happy that you screened the film. So I just wanted to thank you guys very much. It really means a lot. So I'm really happy to be talking to you, Amy, as well. As you mentioned, we've been talking about my films for a lot of years now, and that's really cool. It's a rare interchange. Anyway, so yeah, I'll try to sort of compress an answer about the land because I know we have a lot of things we want to cover, but yes, it is really a central almost character in the film, a central presence. And there are some, kind of, there are things about it that aren't necessarily made explicit when you're watching the film. You can't sort of see it, but kind of histories that are there and embedded. And sometimes I do that and just think, well, when we have conversations about the films, then these things will come out. So for instance, one of the trajectories that we followed in shooting was the course of the Los Angeles aqueduct. So basically one of the main sources for how Los Angeles gets its water. The other main source being, of course, the Colorado River. And you know, most of California is a desert and is not really meant to be growing food. The land, on mass scale, not meant to be producing, having huge kind of agribusiness. And Los Angeles, for sure, was never supposed to be this kind of tropical paradise. It was not, right? So, um, underneath, the visuals is this really kind of difficult history, which of course really ultimately is the history of settler colonialism and the violence that is, and that continues, right? That in a way, these kids leaving civilization, right? They're leaving. So the idea was that they're, leaving some kind of, or various forms of collapse and catastrophe, which of course I was hoping that I figured viewers would not have to stretch far to guess what those things are, right? So we're in them, whether that's, surveillance, the oppressiveness of the state, for example, in the form of like rampant police brutality, the carceral systems, as you've mentioned, all these kind, climate collapse, the ways in which capital, white supremacy, settler colonialism, right? These things have proven to be totally unsustainable for people and for the planet. And so when I think about the kids are sort of, fleeing collapse, they're leaving this thing that does not work and is unsafe, right? Totally dangerous. And in a way, it goes back to those roots of settler colonialism, right? So the people who were initially living on the land that we travel along in this film were the Paiute Indians for the most part, and then up further north, Miwok, Native Americans. So the wars over water for Los Angeles, in so many ways, like, again, without getting, I won't like try to go in, I could, but I won't go into, a long devolving history around it, but just to say, as things are still manifested today, imagine newspaper conglomerates, wealthy investors, and politicians all in each other's hand in hand and in each other's pockets, making deals happen. Oh, and the military, right? So the US military in like 1863 were, they called it the Owens Valley Indian War, right? But it was just settlers. The US military came in and they say, pushed out the Paiute, right? So drove people from their land. And so when we talk about the water wars, it's really between settlers and settlers. So kind of long story short, the kind of burgeoning metropolis that Los Angeles was becoming, and I have so many little side thoughts, it's easy for me to diverge, required more and more water. And so the ways that happened, though, and so there were people, kind of settlers, sort of trying to farm in the Owens River Valley, and these Mulholland and these other kind of big deals in Los Angeles were basically like they'd buy up the land as private citizens and then sell it back to themselves as the mayor, kind of thing. Eaton did that, right? So there was all kinds of dealing. So long story short, they start sucking all the water from Owens River to Los Angeles. They build this aqueduct, and then the people who were the settlers who were there farming can't farm anymore. And so the picture, I guess, again, without going into the whole long, many stories that are involved in that, including like in 1929, when some of this was starting, the mayor of Los Angeles was a Ku Klux Klan member. So there was this idea, there was an idea of Los Angeles being like an Aryan return. It's really just soaked in blood, the whole thing. So we follow the course of that waterway in some ways as a kind of undoing and unrolling and an unraveling, going back. And we end at Mono Lake, which again, when they had drained the Owens River Valley, they reached further to Mono Lake, which is like a 760,000-year-old body of water. That's crucial to all kinds of biorelations there and wildlife. Anyway, so there's all that kind of history that's sort of embedded in it for me that I didn't feel that I needed to necessarily like make explicit informationally in the film, but that it would be this history that's there that people can look into, and that's an imprint. Like that's just like an historical imprint which mirrors the same types of dynamics and relationships today that are destroying the planet, destroying lives, even down to like the fact that when water does become scarce, as we just saw, like when there are water issues in Jackson, Mississippi, in Flint, Michigan, in Texas and Oregon, right? When infrastructure fails, who's hit the hardest? It's always poorest, most marginalized communities, usually communities of color. So these systems just continue anyway.
Yeah.
Without saying all of that, those things are embedded in my interests, right, in the film.
Well, I mean, and I think you see that in the film itself. I mean, they're embedded in it, but I mean, you look at the way that you shoot the film, you know, you've got so many of your shots. You frame the two central characters against like a backdrop of mountains or some other kind of backdrop, and then the camera will tilt up and suddenly we see like, you know, a power grid or transformers. So we're immediately reminded of that kind of infrastructure, which ties right back into those histories that you're talking about.
Yeah. And yes, I'm glad that you sort of noticed that and think about, because that's something I was thinking about, and also continually sort of wanting to show the smallness of the humans in relationship to the scale of the earth, to remind us of our scale, right? And in relationship to the earth, and at the same time, not to like make the kids seem small, but just sort of more in terms of humans on the planet, to remind us who is in charge here. Really, this rock that we live on is, and or maybe in charge is the wrong word, but a power that should, a presence and a living being that should obviously be kind of reckoned with. And again, the, you know, original peoples living in those areas were living in a way that was sustainable in relation. Anyway, yes. So then, yeah, and then panning up and looking at bits of infrastructure that are there or left there. I mean, the funny thing too was navigating permissions to film in certain areas was tricky and interesting, because the Department of Water and Power owns almost every bit of land along all the 395, that entire corridor in the Eastern Sierras. So I'd be looking at these land ownership maps, trying to figure out, well, who should I talk to for permission? And of course, once I realized that it was almost all, like 90% of the land is DWP, I was like, oh, well, forget it. We're just going to squat, because screw them.
Yeah.
Hope they're not watching. Anyway, but yeah. So.
Yeah. Of course, that like ties all back into, I mean, land ownership, private control, corporate control of these natural resources, or tying back to extractive technologies and, you know, these other ideas about settler colonialism and extraction. And I think your note about the change of scale, I think that's so throughout. You make these really interesting, there's these really interesting moments throughout. I mean, not just, these kids positioned against the sort of geologic time of the mountains, but, you have early on like a shot of Elijah looking at ants or this dead hare, which I think just that kind of shift in physical scale also gets you to think about the changes of lifespan or the differences in lifespan between these different animals, and maybe what we might owe each other in terms of that sort of interrelationship, or our sort of relational status with other beings.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it's they're looking, because there's a lot of the camera looking, like the camera gaze really on purpose, doing these very long shots, looking at things that don't move, like mountains, which are moving very, very, very slowly. And then the kids looking. So them, so there was hoping anyway to sort of have these layers of looking and seeing and noticing and being in relation. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think that that kind of leads into the idea that, this film is part of the Arts Club's exhibition, Upkeep Everyday Strategies of Care, which is, brings together a number of artists who are interested in everyday activities of care, whether that be relational, the relationship between a caregiver or a recipient of care, or attentiveness or kind of maintenance of a space or a site, or even kind of self-care, and maybe also how all those things are interrelated. And I mean, I think that this film, there's a lot of care in the film. It's sort of expression in and of itself. But the film stars your son, or it's one of the main characters is played by your son, Lenny, and also his friend, Elijah.
Mm-hmm.
And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about maybe why it was important to cast someone who is so familiar to you, or you had this relationship with, and then also how, their real life friendship may have influenced how that plays out in the film.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess the first level of the answer is just that I was really, really thinking about the youth. I was thinking about this next generation, right, and what they're inheriting. And I think at the time that I was starting to work on it or vision it, it was that around that time that people were really talking about this clock, right? The Earth's clock and this ticking, and thinking about what is it like for kids having that sense of like no future, like the scientists basically saying, sorry, time's out for your life. So I was thinking about that generation a lot. And so when I realized what the film would be, of course, I have this generation right here in my backyard, in my house. So so that's like, there was kind of the obvious choice that, well, see if my kid is into it. And but also I almost always work with real people in my films and don't usually work with actors. And so there's, excuse me, I think because of the nature of the kinds of themes that run through the work, as you've kind of mentioned, there are these recurring sort of end times, who has agency, who doesn't, how do we deal with each other and get power. It's always made sense to me to have real people in relation, so that there's an element of just actually living, happening inside, as opposed to performing an idea. Not to say that there's like one way is better than the other. It's just a way that I like to work. And so that also then just made sense with this. And so it never like occurred to me at all to like cast actors, just because my process is very much just about like wanting there to be real experiences happening inside of a film, even if I'm shaping the scenarios. And so it just automatically made sense to see if Lenny and Elijah would want to do it. And because I mean, Elijah lives next door. I can hear him, like he's working on his music right now, like that. And they were born 3 weeks apart, so they have literally known each other their whole lives. So it just kind of made sense. And they still hang out, which is really neat. It's ongoing kind of life that is developing. Yeah. And then so it made sense to just really have Lenny cast it, have those guys cast it, be like, hey, do you have some other friends? You want to see who's into it? And just sort of, so it was very organic in that sense. So I didn't necessarily think from the outset that it was about like him being my son per se, but more so young people who are in my life. Some people have asked, oh, is this, like a kind of a coming of age tale in terms of like, because there's no grown-ups, right, in the film. The kids are all on their own. And people have said like, oh, is this about, your son growing up and leaving home? And then which is I can see that, that piece of story, but the works are so rarely autobiographical for me. They're just so rarely, like, I will draw from my own life or my own experience in lots of the films. Like, It's Cool, I'm Good is tons of real anecdotes, and it is my body there doing the performing, but it's never explicitly supposed to be about me. Even like films where my family appears or my mom, is never, the focus is never, oh, this is me and my family because we're particularly interesting. It has always just been like, here is a life that is right here, whose story is embedded with these themes I'm interested in. So let this be present, kind of thing. So yeah, so it's, yeah, those are the main reasons
Yeah.
why.
I think the film, is obviously about adolescence, casts these two adolescent boys, and then later these two adolescent girls who are also friends of Lenny and played by two sisters.
Yeah.
And it seems so much to be about this kind of in-between stage, right? Not yet, no longer children, not quite yet adults, a kind of becoming or coming into, as you mentioned, they're inheriting this particular future that they've been told isn't actually going to happen, that, this is a kind of end times. And we got a question in from the chat that asks if you're kind of seeing this, seeing the youth or seeing the adolescents that are in your film as, occupying a kind of fugitive or resistance, this sort of in between, not here, not nor there, this sort of different sort of position, and then how they might be able to like actualize a new potential or a new kind of mode of making way in this world.
That's a nice question. That's a really cool question. Thank you, whoever submitted that. Absolutely. Yes, right. And I think the word fugitive is good there. So is resistance, right? Yes, they do embody both. And fugitive, I guess, on multiple levels, right? Like they are at once literally fugitive, where they are fleeing and leaving that which is oppressive, untenable, unlivable. They are escaping capture, I imagine, especially like when I chose to have us pan up to that helicopter. That was, the helicopters police helicopters are a constant presence in LA for anyone who lives here, has been here, knows that, especially in certain neighborhoods like our neighborhood. The kids have lived under constant, they're just, it's this sound and this presence that's always sort of there. So they are um, definitely fleeing, a police state in a sense. And also they are hopefully for sure embodying a kind of resistance, um, and like getting away. And absolutely, I think it's funny because I don't want to project too much on them or have youth be this vehicle to carry a burden of kind of all types of metaphors and ideas, right? Which youth often is, in film. But yes, for sure, they represent, or maybe if I don't even say like they don't necessarily represent, they are literally in the lived experience, they are having to make a new way forward. They're having to, they're having to, and they are going to have to continue to invent new ways of doing things. And they do it all the time. And they're having to innovate both, they're going to have to innovate a new physical world or new infrastructure, but also they're having to, their world, their outlook and their sense of relation and everything, right, is kind of, is forming in relation to so much that almost requires of it to be, um, um, integrating resistance constantly, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That was a very good question, and my answer was a little messy, but I hope that made sense.
Well, I mean, I think that, one of the things that, we've talked about and I think comes up, especially in relation to the show, is that, so much, it's built around their companionship, their friendship. I mean, they're various, very obvious expressions of care for one another, from warming one's foot on, one friend's foot on another's chest, or making sure that, like Lenny's making sure that Elijah is comfortable and warm and has a pillow under his head. Like there's all these moments of, being like thinking beyond oneself towards another person that, are continually modeled in the film, or the two sisters, pumping drinking water out of the lake for each other. And I think about those kinds of relationships in this film as being like these kinds of models, and as they're making their way in the world, they're also kind of modeling new ways of caring for each other, and knowing that the only way they're going to make it is through this kind of relational structure that is built around care and reciprocity, as opposed to taking advantage of each other, right?
Yeah, and I think, again, that's where we are. That's where for many communities that is right, like care, outside of a kind of more, like, I don't know, upper middle class sort of straight nuclear family setup. As soon as you move outside of that, care is innovated in all kinds of different ways, and usually inside of community, right? It's something that has to be shared. Again, like in Western capitalism, it's life is only sustainable for a few people without a community support network. And obviously we saw that explode in COVID times, right? Like in this year, we saw the expansion of mutual aid networks like we've never seen before, perhaps. And that just makes it so clear that, like, when the government couldn't and wouldn't care literally for people, people cared for each other. And people set up networks for delivering food and helping people get medicines that they needed and helping people pay rent, and all, just I could go on and on with the ways in which it is clear that care and caretaking happens on a community level, and must and will. And so again, in the film, that is why they encounter other kids.
Right.
And that's what the whole ending is all about, is that, yes, there will be community, and there will have to be, and they will have to share whatever they have with each other, and they will all bring something to it. And again, so that's like to be read literally, and also, of course, we can read it symbolically in terms of like that, if right, for all of us, and like in the way that they're kind of only partly prepared in the stuff they put in their backpacks. It's sort of like, right, we are only partly prepared to deal, and we're going to have to, maybe someone else brought a knife and someone else has a lighter. Okay, great, we need both of those things. Do you know what I mean? But like, if you're alone with your knife, it's not as good as if you're with the person who also has the lighter. You know what I mean? That kind of thing. So again, I was trying to see if I could maybe initiate people thinking about these kinds of things with the most minimal props and gestures and storyline possible.
Yeah. I mean, and I love that. I love this, the way that you're talking about this, because I mean, especially in thinking about those scenes where they're prepared, they're packing their backpacks. And I feel like adults looking at this would be like, why would you pack that? Like there's I think you're really pointing out for the viewers, and maybe we'll have this moment of self-reflection while watching it, this kind of arrogance of adulthood, right? Like, we know it all, when in fact, we absolutely know so little. I mean, going into this pandemic, for example, we know maybe there were some of us who knew quite a bit, but for the majority of us, we knew very little, and especially how to prepare or what to expect in the future. And I think part of what you're proposing, which I find so amazing, is also this sense that mastery, the idea of mastery and expertise, can get in the way. And in fact, we're all making our way through this world, and we all need to kind of collaborate and work together, and work in a different kind of relational way, rather than one person has the answers for everything, or we think that we might know everything, when in fact the opposite is the case.
Yeah.
One of the questions that's coming in, there's a couple of questions that we have that are coming in that want to talk about sound.
Okay. Yeah,
and the sound for the film. So you're known for making really verbose films where people, when you talked about It's Cool, I'm Good, you're performing for the camera, you're talking to the camera person as if it's another character for the whole time. Say Stand in the Stream. There's a lot of dialogue, a lot of sort of deluge of digital imagery, which is a recent work. And this film has no dialogue, super rich soundtrack that you've built from multiple sources, from kind of full lead sound, or some, sound that you've taken on location, to different tracks of music, also, inspired by your collaborators, Elijah and Lenny. And maybe you can talk a little bit about the soundtrack, which I think is really incredible for moving you through, not just through the kind of the narrative of the film, but kind of moving the viewer in and out of it to create space from the film for reflection, or immerse you into its kind of story. It operates in a really interesting way. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about the sources and your kind of thinking around that structure.
Sure. Yeah. It's funny because I always want to hear from people, well, how did it work for you? Like, what was it like? But yes, like, since there's no dialogue, obviously it was clear to me that the way I built the sound score would have to be, I guess with all the films, the sound score tends to bear a lot of meaning and do a lot of the work along with image for making narrative and story. And so that's kind of always been a way that I work, like knowing that what we hear, if we hear wind, it's really different than if we hear a chopper, and that sets tone, it brings content. So a lot of careful thought went into that with this. A lot of what seems like natural sound in many of the scenes is not natural sound. It'll be sort of industrial sounds or sounds that were created through the computer. And that was to both remind the viewer maybe that we're in a place that is real and not real. So that always a little bit delaminating from reality a little bit. So, and also to maybe to think about, like, is there even such thing as a natural world anymore? What is nature with a capital N, right? It's like become this construct. So I like to play with that. And then there's obviously this constant decision making around how much sound to and how much to kind of push moods and not. And that's just always a learning curve and experiments with what, trying to hopefully find a place that feels like there's that you can evoke feeling and at the same time not be manipulating it too much. So I worked with a number of musicians. So Alexia Reiner, Insect Arc were two composers and musicians who sent me stems of things like, so the Brian Eno track, Somber Reptiles, really kind of forms like a center of the film. And so myself and other musicians spent time kind of trying to make various covers of either Somber Reptiles or Dark Trees, which is the song you hear at the end, and kind of doing covers of those, but then pulling them apart, knowing that it wasn't making like a cover wasn't going to be the thing, but that generating sounds that felt related to and around it was really generative and wonderful. And so sometimes only one little element from one of those would end up, and then I would make other music in the studio to go with it. So it was a really, I often compose as I'm editing so that it's kind of a real back and forth. I hope I'm not rambling too much here, but I knew that I always knew from the very beginning that there would not be dialogue in this film. And I guess the main reason why was I guess at that point, in some ways, just feeling exhausted by language, because I was just obsessively consuming news and the chatter of social media. But as you know, I mean, I love language. I just thought, I mean, hopefully one grows and changes as an artist. And so that's like, there's, trying new things, but I just knew intuitively, I think I don't need to say anything right now. People know, and let me make a thing that gives enough space for people to have their own imagination present in as much of a way as possible. Because I think that I wanted it to be like simultaneously a space of respite, like, oh, can we just sit with the earth for a minute? Can we just sit here with these kids? Can we just sit like in our hearts, not to sound cheesy, but really like in this time, and think about these kids and this life? And so I wanted there to be places where we were just looking at the mountains together, you know what I mean, kind of thing. And then I also, so I wanted it to be a place of respite, but also an active place, like that wasn't, I don't know. I just knew, I thought, I don't need to tell you, you guys know, and you can fill in these blanks. And I think I had told you, like I had edited out some scenes where there had initially been these flashback scenes, which showed wildfires, flooding, police violence. And I pulled those things out because I thought, we know, everybody knows, and more. And so I thought the more open I can leave it. And so, yeah, I just knew that no one would need to talk in this.
I mean, there's what's interesting too is that you have moments that kind of cue into the lives of your characters. Like you have this sample from a Lil Peep composition, and then Elijah contributes a composition. So there's also things that kind of cue you to a kind of social space or milieu for
Yes, for sure. No, and I'm glad you reminded me. I get carried away. Yes, first of all, shout out to Eli So Drippy, who contributed some of his original music, which I asked him for. So when you see that flashback of him working on Ableton, and he makes music of his own, and gave me some really crazy, weird beats he had made that were great. And but yes, initially the film had little bits of samples from music that were songs that had been significant in some way to the kids that either marked a period of time. I was like, like between 2012 and 2016, like what were the most important songs then for you guys? So there was some early SoundCloud, there was like some XXX Tentacion, Lil Uzi Vert, A$AP Rocky, Tyler the Creator, some music that just had these kind of markers for the kids, and Lil Peep. And then I gradually pulled those out, in part just because getting rights to and licensing for everything was getting complicated. But yeah, and I was really sad when I pulled them out at first. And then again, it was okay because it went back to this kind of openness. And so Alexia and I kind of recreated some of those songs in like almost ghosty bits, like where you kind of hear them, but it's not the exact thing. So it's not really a cover, but something that would just sort of go in a ghosty way, refer to it and hopefully have the vibe of it. And again, I thought, well, I guess that leaves it more open and it doesn't close it down too much. And we left the Lil Peep in because I don't know, do we have time? I can anecdotally tell. So for those of you guys who don't know who Lil Peep was, he was an early SoundCloud kind of emo rapper musician that was important in a particular movement of music. And so we had this a little bit of a piece of the music in there. And then I had gotten a letter from sort of his, he died of an overdose at 21, which was sort of this tragic loss. And I ended up getting an email from his mom, and she was like, hey, you need to have the rights to use this music. And I was like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. It's a placeholder, because it was in an early cut of the film. The film wasn't really out yet. And I said, oh yeah, I'm sorry, I can pull it out. I didn't, mean to disrespect you, blah, 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 just, and I'll recompose something for that section, because I was like, can afford the rights. And she said, no, I really support the project and I want you to use the music. I just want you to get the rights and I'll help you get them. And it was sort of this amazing moment. And then mom to mom were emailing, and I'm like, I'm so sorry for your loss. And I was really feeling that. And it was connecting to the grief of the film. And it was just, it was kind of this moment that was so interesting. And of course the kids were like, you're emailing with Lil Peep's mom? Oh my God. But it was so it made sense. Then again, it was back to that thing of like why I use real people, like there was this real thing happening. And so then it made sense to use the thread. So that little bit stays in the film. Okay, now I'm really rambling. Rein me in, sorry.
I also think what's interesting about the soundtrack is, you create a really interesting syncopated rhythm with the soundtrack that I think parallels what you're doing visually. So you shot a lot of the film on 16 millimeter, super 16 millimeter. This is a new format for you. Normally you use video. I know your flashback sequences, I know you were thinking about shooting them in a different format, but I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that kind of, that sort of syncopation, because, you know, there is this sense of like spending some time with these spaces, but then they're often interrupted by like a kind of flashback or a kind of, you know, something happens or the music does something so that, you know, we're pulled out of being lulled into just gazing upon this beautiful landscape. Instead, you're forcing us into a different kind of contemplation or a different line of thinking.
Yes. Wait, what's the question? I'm sorry.
Well, I guess the question is, maybe you could talk a little bit more about your approach to editing or this kind of editing structure.
Okay.
And maybe you could also talk about how 16 millimeter, the sort of analog format, plays a role in that.
Sure. Well, I guess editing for me has always really been where all of the kind of, where all the shaping and making really happens. But it was interesting working with Super 16 for the first time with this film. I learned that it's a slow and careful process. You know, it takes setup, and you have to be really careful about loading the film into the magazine and setting your light. It has to be just so, because there's no playback. We shot without a monitor. So we're up there, you know, 12,000 feet in a blizzard with no way to check, okay, did we get the shot? So you have to sort of really get it. So it's a really different process. And so a different kind of looking for me as the director, and a different kind of capture experience. So there's that, which was amazing, and I loved it. And now, of course, I just only want to shoot on film, but it's prohibitively expensive. But editing, how do I talk about editing? It's the most kind of complicated place. I'll try to see if I can address what you brought up. Well, for instance, the pacing of this film is really different than, let's say, Stand in the Stream. And weirdly, not on purpose, but in retrospect, I started to think, oh, No Go Backs is almost like a kind of sequel to Stand in the Stream in this sense. And in a nice way, like just oppositional, like just, you know, where Stand in the Stream is all digitally sourced, whether like from various kinds of, you know, cell phones and live streams and digital, it's all digital. And the editing is moving quickly, kind of mirroring the pacing of our window clicking and screen clicking. And Stand in the Stream is so deeply analog. We've left that space. We've left convenience and safety or whatever, you know, we've left what's quick and consumable. And so we're in this slower analog time. And but it's still following like what Stand in the Stream brings us into the, like the frenetic disarray and danger of late capitalist, you know, life. And it's like, oh, here, and now we've escaped. And so I knew that because I was shooting these long shots, and I that there was going to be time, and I knew that there was not going to be dialogue. So I knew that we're going to go more slowly. So the editing would have more breathing room and more space in it. But yeah, there's always that question of pacing and timing and rhythm, and where do we linger, and then when do we move? And so I guess traveling is that same way. Like you're trying to mirror, well, what is the sense of, like, sometimes we can languish here and sometimes there's an urgency, right? You can't just languish in the snow, you're going to freeze to death. And so when does that rhythm need to change? Yeah. So yeah.
I wonder if maybe it's just kind of a closing question, because we're running out of time. If you could talk a little bit about the title for the film. I mean, I mentioned to you that it reminded me of like that childhood phrase, like when you're making a
Yeah.
promise to your friend and they say no go backs, you know, and it
Yeah.
becomes a kind of promise or commitment.
Mhm.
But you know, time is built into the title of the film. So I wonder if you can talk a little bit more about that too.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's, yes, it's a sort of double entendre, right? Like when you give something to someone and kids go, no go backs, right? You can't give it back. We can't get the planet back. There's no going back. They can't go back to whatever they fled from. What has been done can't be undone. There's no go backs. We did this. So that is really what it is. I like that someone wrote, I feel like queer care has been post-apocalyptic since the beginning. Yes, I agree. I guess I'm sorry, that's like just wanted to address that because I saw it pop on there. But yes, I think that is my point, is that there's so many kinds of care that have been necessary when you are not cared for in the broader society, and people care for each other. And that really is the theme of the film.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And let's see, are there any other questions from the out there, from the beyond? I can't tell like where people, how many do we even know here?
I think that I think one other question, if we have time, there's one other question kind of, you know, along the lines of queer care, is about the sort of gender separation that you kind of create between pairing these friends, these
Mm-hmm.
two, Lenny and Elijah, and then these two sisters, and you know, pairing them in terms of gender.
Yeah, and that was not intentional. And I did think a lot, obviously I thought a lot about it once we had that cast, because it was Lenny was, good friends with Marisol and Serafina, and so it worked that they were going to, that they wanted to do this, and we were kind of running out of time, and I was like, great, those kids want to do it. Oh yeah, those girls are awesome. And then I did worry. I thought, oh, is there going to be an interpretation of this like Noah's Ark kind of thing, and some kind of cis het straight, and I was like, oh no, that would be so weird. And then and then it's funny because I asked one of my grad students at the time who had also worked on the film as a production assistant, Chester, and I said, what do you think of this? Do you see this? And he said, whoever sees that, that's in their heads. And I was like, oh, boom, right. Like he was like, that's assuming that the two boys aren't potentially queer, or that there's so many other combinations. He was like, that's just a really kind of a more old school view, and that's in the eye of the viewer. So that was interesting. And then also, I always knew there was going to be this influx of community at the end, and we would see all these different kids leaving. But I did edit that to come very quickly after the two girls rise over the hill, so that we didn't linger too long on the potential idea that this was going to be about some kind of mating pairing thing. But it wasn't intentional to have that be two gendered journeys. It's just sort of, yeah. And I thought that that's okay too, to have, because another way to think of it is like, yeah, girls having autonomous space. And anyway, yes. But right. I know we have to wrap up. And so,
well, I think, there's so much there that's so rich. I mean, I think your graduate student's comment is so right on, this idea that, whatever is being brought to the table might also be emblematic of this kind of system, right? That you are making a work to point out or to work against, or to queer, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, yes. So thank you so much, Stanya. This has been so wonderful. It's always so great to talk to you. And I just love this work, and I'm so excited for it to be out in the world.
Thank you so much, Amy. Thank you, Janine and Jenna, for your technical wizardry. And thank you, everybody who came. I can't see you, but thanks.
Yes, thank
Yay.
you.